Hello, my name is Frank Donnelly and I'm the Geospatial Data Librarian at Baruch College, City University of New York, and the author of Exploring the US Census, Your Guide to America's Data. This is the first video in a series of screencasts where I'll demonstrate how to find and access US Census data using several different websites and tools. In this video, I'm going to cover basic census concepts that you need to understand in order to effectively search for and use US Census data. All of the resources that I'll cover in this series will require you to make some choices in order to find the data you're looking for, so you can narrow down the options to a manageable subset. This video is basically the prerequisite for the others that follow. The idea is that I'll cover the concepts here in this slide presentation so that in future videos we can focus just specifically on navigating the resources and using the tools. Now, contrary to popular belief, the census isn't simply the thing that happens every 10 years. It's actually a rich collection of many different data sets. They all kind of do the same thing. They summarize people, houses, and businesses by place and by subject. Census data is very geographically detailed. It's collected over varying periods of time. And although the data sets are different, they use consistent definitions and terminology. And the data sets that we'll be talking about are summary data sets. Individual responses to all the census forms are confidential, and basically what we're getting here is data about people and places, and we're not getting information about individuals. But because there are dozens of different data sets and thousands of variables and tens of thousands of tables that cover a long period of time, you're going to need to narrow things down by making a series of choices instead of simply searching across the entire spectrum of data that exists. So in this video, I'll briefly discuss these 4 choices that you'll need to make: a data set, a time frame, topics or subjects, and census geography. For the data sets, I'm going to focus on the big 3 demographic series: the Decennial Census, the American Community Survey, or ACS, and the Population Estimates Program. But first, let's begin with how census data is organized. The data is grouped into a series of thematically related tables of varying detail, and when you search across any of the census websites that we'll look at in future videos, you'll be searching across these tables. So typically you're not going to pick and choose individual variables that you'll assemble into an extract, but instead you're going to select one or more tables that contain what you need, and maybe in some cases may contain more than what you need. In general, data for the American Community Survey and the Decennial Census is published in a 3 series of tables. At the top here, we can see that the data profile tables are the fewest in number and contain the widest variety of variables. There are 4 of them in the ACS, labeled DP02 through 05, and they're grouped into pretty broad categories: social, economic, housing, and demographic. And then there's 1 data profile for the Decennial Census, labeled DP1, and all of these include some of the most commonly sought statistics. Below this are the subject tables in the ACS, or in the 2010 census they were called quick tables. These contain fewer variables that are grouped around a specific subject, like the labor force, education, or income. They'll contain a number of variables related to those topics, cross-tabbed by age, sex, and race, with counts or estimates and percent totals. Lastly, the detail tables are the most specific and narrow in that they contain data for just one variable presented for one specific group. So for example, if we looked at the median household income table in the ACS, B19013, it will contain just that one statistic for the geographies in the table, so just median household income. There'll be separate detailed tables which would cross-tab median household income with age and sex, or race and tenure, or some other group. In contrast, the subject table will include all of this information in a single table. So in the ACS, the detail tables are prefixed with the letter B or C, while in the Decennial Census they begin with the letter P or H, indicating whether they summarize people or housing units. So you'll have a choice to make. Do you want 1 or 2 large tables with a lot of data that you'll probably have to filter or reduce in a spreadsheet or stats package after you download it? Or do you want a larger number of small tables that contain just the information you want and that you'll probably have to knit or join together after downloading them? It's really up to you based on what your research goals are. But let's start now with the choices that you have to make. We have data set, time frame, subjects, and geography. The biggest choice that you'll need to make is your data set, and I'm going to cover three of them here. The first data set is the Decennial Census. This is the original census data set and what most people think of when they hear about the census. It's a 100% count of the population taken every 10 years on April 1st. It's actually written into the US Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. The data in the decennial census is published down to the census block level, and census blocks are the smallest possible geographies that you can get data for. They're basically somewhat analogous to city blocks. The decennial census is released in a series of different data sets. The first one is the redistricting file, PL 94171. So if the census is conducted in April of, let's say, 2020, the public redistricting data set will be the first one that's released the following year, sometime in the spring. It's very small and will consist of just a few tables, but it will go down to the census block level. Following that, in the summer into the fall, we'll get Summary File 1. Summary File 1 is really the principal data set for the decennial census. Much later, we'll get Summary File 2, which is a cross-tab of additional variables that's usually used by a smaller subset of people. So public redistricting will be the first one that people will be interested in, and then Summary File 1 will kind of eclipse that. The 2010 and 2020 census contained just basic demographic variables. And what do I mean by that? Basically these: population, age and sex, race and Hispanic origin, households and families, how people are related to one another, count of housing units, and whether housing is occupied or vacant, and whether people are homeowners or renters. That's it. It's just from in 2010 and 2020, just those basic variables. The 2000 census and backward contained a lot more information, but that hasn't been the case from 2020 to present. So in summary, the decennial census gives you a precise count of the population at one point in time, and you'll use it when you need absolute counts of the population as opposed to estimates, or you want data for the smallest possible geographic areas, or you're interested in working with just basic demographic variables, or you're making comparisons over time to earlier decennial censuses, which have been conducted since the year 1790. For anything else, for data that's released on an ongoing basis, and for more detailed socioeconomic characteristics of the population, the American Community Survey, or ACS, is going to be what you'll look at. The ACS was launched in 2005. It's a rolling sample survey of 3.5 million addresses, and the data is published as estimates with margins of error. So you have a value plus or minus some other value. There are two different series that are released. A one-year average is released for all geographies or all places in the United States, regardless of what kind of place it is, that has at least 65,000 people or more. For any areas that are smaller than that, the Census Bureau publishes a 5-year average for all geographies down to the census tract level. Actually, they do publish data down to the census block group level, but it's not very reliable. We'll talk a little bit more about the census geography in a little bit. So you have 1-year averages for really big places, and then 5-year averages for everything else down to the census tract level. And the reason that they do this is that the size of the sample is just not large enough to produce reliable estimates on an annual basis for smaller places. The ACS is released in autumn each year for the previous year, so there'll be a new 1-year average, and then the 5-year average is basically recomputed by dropping the oldest year and adding the new one and then creating a new average. The ACS contains all of the variables that are published in the decennial census, plus all of these additional variables that used to be part of the census in the year 2000 and back, but are no longer collected in the decennial census. So educational enrollment and attainment, income and poverty, language, labor force, home value, and rent. There are a lot of different statistics in the ACS. In summary, the ACS is going to give you detailed socioeconomic characteristics of the population on an ongoing basis. And you'll use it when you want these characteristics because they're not part of the decennial census, or you want the most recent data that's available. But there are some important caveats to using the ACS. The ACS estimates are much fuzzier than the 10-year census as they represent a possible range of values over a longer period of time. And each ACS estimate is published in pairs. You have an estimate and you have a margin of error. So just for example, this is a census tract that's located in Manhattan in the Gramercy Park area. In 2010, there were 7,614 residents living in this census tract. Compare that to the 2008-2012 ACS. So during this 5-year period, we can say there are approximately 6,383 residents, plus or minus 817. So essentially, the estimate really represents the midpoint of a possible range of values, and then the margin of error tells us plus and minus that estimate what the range is. So another way of saying this is that, whoops, let me go skip ahead there by accident. What this means is that the population could actually be as low as 5,566 or as high as 7,200 people. And the ACS uses a 90% confidence interval, which means that there's actually a 10% chance that the actual population falls outside this range. So this is important to consider. The smaller a particular population group is, or the smaller a geography is, the less reliable the estimate will be. So when you look at the ACS data, you'll have the estimate and you'll also have this margin of error, and you do have to pay attention to the margin of error. If it's very large relative to the size of the estimate, then it's not really a great estimate. Then you can make relative claims that an area has more or less people, but it's going to be difficult to be precise. So definitely pay attention to the margin of error for the ACS estimates. The third data set is one that doesn't get as much attention, I think. I'll just mention it in passing. The Population Estimates Program. These are annual estimates that are created using calculations that look at births, deaths, and migration with the 10-year census as a baseline. So instead of being a count or a sample survey, the Population Estimates Program uses administrative statistics and vital statistics about births, deaths, and movement to figure out how many people there are in each year. The data in this data set is limited to just basic variables like total population, sex, age, race, and housing units. It does include components of change, so there are values for births, deaths, and migration, and it's limited to just really large geographic areas. So basically you would use the population estimates when you want to study basic demographic characteristics of the population and population change for large areas on an annual basis. It'll be more up to date than the Decennial Census, it'll be less fuzzy than the ACS, and generally it's a much smaller and easier data set to work with. So, data sets, those are basically one of the probably the most important choice that you have to make up front, and in choosing one of these you'll really limit the amount of data that you're searching through. Time frame is the second choice that you'll make, and probably the simplest one because the data set kind of determines it for you. The Decennial Census is only available every 10 years for years ending in 0. The ACS is published annually, and we mentioned as a 1-year period and a 5-year period estimate. So for the year 2018, the 1-year period will be 2018, and the 5-year period will be 2014-2018. And then the population estimates, they are released annually as well, but as a vintage. So when a new series of estimates comes out, you have a new year of data, plus all the previous years going back to the last decennial census. And unlike the other data series, the population estimates, the past data may be revised. So when you're working with these estimates, you're basically going to use one vintage, and then when the next vintage comes out, it will completely replace the previous one. But time frame, pretty basic. Choose your data set, your time frame, and you're also going to have to make some choices about the topic or subject categories that you're interested in. So in the census, data for the population and for housing units is subdivided into different groups based on shared characteristics. So for example, the population is subdivided into households, which are basically one or more people that live together in a residential kind of setting, and group quarters, which are many people living together in kind of an institutional setting. You can think of these as like penitentiaries, nursing homes, college dormitories, military barracks, things like that. Households can be divided into families and non-families, and in this case a family is defined as 2 or more people that live together in this kind of residential setting, and they're related to one another either by marriage, adoption, or by blood. In contrast, the non-family households include single-family households, unmarried partners, people living together with roommates. This is important because as you look for census data, you'll see statistics like median household income and median family income, which represent income for these distinct groups of people. And while some of these terms may seem colloquial to us, like the term family seems to be kind of a generic term, in the census universe, this is a very specific category. So in short, don't assume that your definition of a term like family is what the Census Bureau's definition is. Instead, check the documentation or the glossary or metadata that comes with the website, comes with the data rather. If we were trying to characterize income across the United States, for example, we'd probably want to use household income because families represent just a small and specific segment of the population. Along with that, every census table is going to provide data for a specific segment of the population, and it's important to understand what that segment is so that we don't make incorrect assumptions. So for example, in the ACS, table B23025 is for employment status. That table doesn't provide data for the entire population. Its subset or universe is just the population 16 years and over. So when we look at this table and download it or see it on the website, there'll be a total category at the top. That total is not the total population. It is the total universe for that particular table. Because in this sense, if we're looking at employment status, it doesn't make sense to look at people younger than 16 because they're not really going to be working or part of the labor force. And then the way that you'll see the tables online and also when you download them in a spreadsheet is that they will be indented or faceted this way so you can see which categories or which groups nest within other groups. So you have the labor force, and then you have the people who are not in the labor force. And then within the labor force, there's the civilian labor force, which is subdivided into employed and unemployed. And then outside that, you have the armed forces. This is important too, because if you're trying to measure the unemployed population, you have to understand that that unemployed population, like the unemployment rate, is basically just the percentage of people in the civilian labor force who are currently not employed. That does not include people in the armed forces, and it doesn't include people who are not in the labor force. So important to pay attention to how the data is subdivided and also what this total is referring to or what the universe is for the particular table. So those are topics. The last thing that you'll need to consider is geography. Census data basically describes people in places. So this is your fourth and final choice. You got to choose a geography. The Census Bureau publishes data for a variety of legal areas. So legal areas are areas that exist as a matter of the law, like states and counties that have formal boundaries. And statistical areas. These are usually areas that are created by the Census Bureau for the purpose of presenting census data. All of the census geographies are built from census blocks down here, which are the smallest geographical unit in the census. The blocks basically represent bounded settings. So you can think of it kind of like a city block in that it's bounded by streets or maybe by water, but these are delineated all across the country for rural areas too. The boundaries may be roads, they may be rivers, they may be bodies of water, they could be even sharp features in the terrain. Legal boundaries and property boundaries might also mark the edge, but the blocks are the smallest. And then basically the blocks are used to build all of the areas that are bigger than that, and at the same time they're also constrained by the legal areas which exist as a matter of fact. So in this example we're looking at the United States and we see that it's subdivided into the 50 states plus DC, so there's Delaware, and then Delaware can be broken down, and all the states can be broken down into counties, which are the legal subdivisions of states, and then below that we have census tracts, which are a statistical area created by the Census Bureau. They're designed to have between 1,200 and 8,000 people with an optimal size of 4,000 people, and they're often used for studying population within counties or within cities. Tracts can be broken down into block groups, which have between I think about 600 to maybe 3,000 people at the most, and then those can be broken apart into the blocks. each geography has a code that goes with it, and if you concatenate these codes together, you can basically get a unique identifier for every single piece of geography in the United States. These are called ANSI FIPS codes, or more generally, they're known as GeoID codes. And basically, these codes will allow you to join data together from multiple tables. So if you download a table on information about race, and another one about housing units, and another one about income, if they're all for the same place but they're in separate tables, you'll be able to tie them together using this unique identifier for all of the geographies. This is the Census Bureau's official diagram that shows all of the areas that they publish data for. If you notice that central line here in the middle, or this primary trunk, that basically represents what we saw on the previous slide. And to read this, we can say that census blocks basically form block groups, and those form census tracts, and those form counties, and those form states, and so on. So we can see that anything that appears connected with a line, that means that those areas are used to build the area above it, or they nest within the area above it. So I can tell, for example, that census tracts fit within counties, so that means that they're never going to cross county boundaries. The lines that go off to the side don't follow this trunk. So if we look over here to places, places are the census term for cities and towns. Places are built directly from census blocks, and then they fit within states, which means that census tracts might cross a place boundary, and places may not fit within counties because they fall outside of that primary line. The zip code tabulation areas at the top, they don't nest within anything. They're built directly from the census blocks, and they fit within the United States. The reason that this is important is that when you go to download census data, your options to select all geographies that fall inside another geography may be constrained by this nesting. So for example, you can't necessarily get all the zip codes that fall within a county because they don't fit within counties. If you want to explore what the different geographies actually look like, you can visit TigerWeb, and there's a link at the bottom of this slide, which is basically the Census Bureau's reference web map for all its geography. I'll do a brief demo of this in a future video. But one final thing to point out is that geography does change over time. Boundary changes for legal areas like counties and places could happen at any time and are reflected in each new version of the ACS and vintage of the population estimates. On the other hand, the statistical areas like census tracts and zip code tabulation areas, these are only updated every 10 years in conjunction with the Decennial Census, which means that they can be renumbered, renamed, and redrawn. Except for minor corrections, they're usually not modified over the course of a decade. So the 2010 census geography has served as the basis for the 2010 census, and for each version of the ACS and population estimates from 2010 to 2019. The 2020 census geography, which is just being released, that will serve as the new baseline for all the data published in the 2020s. So, where can you actually access and find census data? Well, that's something we're going to explore in our next videos. Since US Census data is free and in the public domain, there are a lot of different websites and tools that you can use. Some resources focus on making it easy to access data by limiting your choices to specific data sets or tables or places, while others aim to provide as much of the data as possible. Some places are good for looking up statistics, while others are better for downloading data in bulk. Some will provide charts and graphs or a map-based interface, while others might be more scaled down and simple. When I'm helping people, I never rely on a single source, but I always use the one that's most appropriate for a given task or research goal. So, in the future videos, I'm going to demonstrate what some of these options are, and then you'll be able to experiment and choose the ones that you like. Alright, lastly, here's the commercial. If you're really interested in getting a firm handle on US Census data, check out my book, Exploring the US Census, Your Guide to America's Data, published by Sage Publications. This is a researcher's guidebook that covers all the main principles, fundamental data sets, and primary tasks for understanding and accessing a vast array of demographic and socioeconomic data from the census, with examples and hands-on exercises using publicly available sources and free and open source software. So I demonstrate how to work with census data using spreadsheets, using SQL databases, and using GIS. And then you can use the data and tools for processing, analyzing, and visualizing data. So the book is available in both print and ebook format. You can get it directly from Sage or from your book retailer of choice, Libris, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. And if you want more information about the book, there's a link at the bottom of this slide. That's also the link to my blog if you're interested in reading more about geospatial data and things related to that. And that's it. Thanks for watching, and tune in for the next few videos where we'll explore and discover census data. Okay, so long for now.